my priority and the priority of the Labour Party is jobs and work. And I'm privileged to be Minister for Business and Employment during very difficult times in this country, or after very difficult times when this country obviously experienced very deep recession. But now we're creating jobs at the rate of about 1,000 a week, but they're good, sustainable jobs.
And while the statistic of an extra 1,000 jobs per week is the statistics that's been thrown around, another statistic is also that there are 1,000 people leaving per week.
The priority is to make sure that the jobs we are creating are decent, well-paid jobs, and where employment protections are increased as well. And I've focused very much on that over the last year and a half as Employment Minister. So for me, it's all about jobs, because jobs in a strong economy is the only way we can resource the public service improvements that we want to see around our schools and our hospitals, our police service, for example.
Right. Now, do you think people see that? Because when people see that unemployment figures have gone down, anecdotally, when you speak to people, they're all saying that's because everybody's leaving. People don't seem to be feeling that, and they don't really seem to be feeling that they're real jobs either.
Well, they are. Everybody has their own individual stories to tell, but the Exchequer figures don't lie. There's been an enormous increase in income tax revenue generated, to the Exchequer over the last 2 years in particular, which shows us, in fact, the number of jobs that have been created. What's also important to note as well, that for example, between the third quarter of, from the end of Q3 in 2014 up to the end of Q3 in 2015, the Central Statistics Office have their data shows very clearly that the vast majority of the new jobs that are created, about 59,000 plus of the 60,000 jobs created, are actually full-time jobs. And that tallies with what the Department of Finance and the Revenue Commissioner say in terms of tax revenue from income tax and PRSI and corporation tax, as well as businesses' situations improve.
Yeah. While the CSO does exactly show that there are an extra 59,000 full-time jobs in the labour market, it doesn't necessarily mean that these are 59,000 new jobs. They could very well have been people who were in part-time work who've now been upgraded to full-time work. Now, while those figures stand up, a lot of people are thinking and are saying, look, we're still paying USC, we're paying property tax, we're paying a higher rate of VAT, there's water charges, there's a host of other things. There's no real change for a lot of people. Okay, the security, people might feel a little bit more secure, but they're paying all these extra charges and these extra taxes, so there's not really
we've I dispute that. I mean, some people will say that clearly. I mean, this country 2011 was on the edge of economic oblivion. We couldn't borrow money from anybody. We were driven into the arms of the Troika, and that came with strings. Now, we've improved the economic situation to a point where, we are creating about 1,000 new jobs a week. We get our deficit down to a much more manageable level. People are getting back to work. Wages are improving as well. We all accept that it takes time for the country to bounce back from the very severe set of circumstances it was in from 2008 to about 2013 in particular. And what we're trying to do is to make sure that not just does the recovery reach every part of Ireland, but reaches every family and everybody is working, and everybody as well who unfortunately still may have to depend on social welfare. I've increased the national minimum wage to make sure that people who are on the lowest levels of income in this country, 124,000 people, get the opportunity to share in the recovery. Remember, one of the first things that Fianna Fáil did when the Troika arrived was take €1 off the rate of national minimum wage. I think that was a shameful action. We restored that immediately when we took office in 2011, and I increased the minimum wage again just a couple of weeks ago. So 124,000 people benefited from that, and all of the employer organisations and trade unions, and indeed independent surveys from recognised accountancy firms would say that the vast majority of employers are going to award pay increases this year. Pay is improving, and I want to make sure that people who are the least well off in society and people who work for a living, that we should always make sure that work always pays, because there's a dignity in work. People shouldn't have to be depending on family income supplement if they're working a full week, and if they're working to try to support their families. That's just not on, and we want to move to a situation where work always pays, people are encouraged to work, and that means adjusting the tax system, and it means ensuring as well that employers pay a decent wage. So I've done a lot of work in terms of introducing new collective bargaining legislation, restoring registered employment agreements, joint labour committees, In fact, last October, because of actions I took, we have now two new employment regulation orders in two very vulnerable industries: contract cleaning and security. 55,000 of the most vulnerable workers in the country got pay rises. They now have sick pay schemes and various other benefits that they didn't have because of a law I introduced. So I'm particularly personally very proud of that, because I'm focused on creating jobs and making sure that work pays and people are protected in their work through strong employment rights legislation which I've introduced.
Okay, so now even on that, on the minimum wage though, it's increased by 50 cents, you said a couple of weeks ago. Is that not too soon in a recovering economy? Does that not put pressure on small businesses and just push more people into a tax bracket?
No, and I've heard that argument. We were very conscious, working with the Low Pay Commission, that when we proposed that the minimum wage would be increased, that there wouldn't be increases in PRSI, for example, or people wouldn't be moved into a different PRSI bracket, whether you're an employee or an employer. So we allocated about 25 million euros in the last budget to make sure that that burden didn't fall on employers, and that people who are on the minimum wage could take home every cent of the increase. We didn't want to see people being burdened with additional PRSI charges because they got a pay increase. That would not make sense. We wanted to make sure that people who are working in minimum wage jobs got an uplift. So if you're a single person working in a minimum wage job for a full week, you will on a net basis be about 900 euros a year better off. In a lot of cases, if you're working a full-time minimum wage, that's about 2 weeks extra pay. Right. So that's significant.
In fact, there are a number of points about that are quite strange, because people on minimum wage will actually pay PRSI. They'll pay about €160 per year. In addition, the increase is not €900, it's €700. And as well as that, some business organisations such as the ISME are completely against the increase in minimum wage. Right. Now, you said you introduced some extra legislation that supports people. People might say, look, legislation be damned. In a tough labour market, it doesn't really make much difference, because you can't go enforcing your rights because you may not get another job. So the legislation doesn't really mean very much to a lot of people at work.
No, it does, because we have strong employment protection legislation that we introduced over the last year and a half. The International Labour Organization, for example, the UN body, have said that Ireland is the only country in the developed world that has actually enhanced employment protection legislation and collective bargaining rights after what was the deepest recession experienced globally since the 1930s. So we've got very strong institutions in this country protecting workers. We've got a strong labour court and a reformed workplace relations commission where people take complaints in relation to how they might be treated at work, and now a fast-tracked system to make sure that people have their rights vindicated much more quickly than was previously the case. So there's hugely important laws there to protect people. And like, for example, the new collective bargaining law that I introduced makes sure that a worker who wants to engage in collective bargaining with their trade union in the workplace cannot be victimised for doing so, and neither can they be unfairly dismissed. There are very, very strong protections there for workers who want to organise with their trade union in their workplace, protections that weren't there previously. Trade unions across Europe have welcomed this legislation and recognise that this is very strong and very robust. And if you contrast that with what the Tories are doing in the UK, absolutely gutting trade union legislation, the trade unions in the UK are looking longingly at the legislation that I introduced, and I know that from my engagements with them. Well, that didn't exactly address the question that I put to him, because I said that we have got legislation there. The difficulty is that it's not really enforceable, because in a tight labour market it's very difficult to enforce your rights, and that wasn't really addressed in his reply. Furthermore, there's a huge backlog of cases at the EAT. In July 2015, it was said in Dáil Questions that the waiting time and the backlog of cases in the EAT is 60 weeks. So even if somebody was to pursue a case, it would take them a very long time for them to get any kind of a resolution out of it, well over a year. And then after the decision being made, they would still have to wait to get compensation from that case, if indeed they were to get compensation from it. Yeah. So that would work very well for people in the trade union sector, but there's a large number of people who aren't unionised, so there's still no protection for them. No, there is. We have strong employment protection legislation in this country, and with the new legislation that I introduced on collective bargaining, people can now have their terms and conditions assessed against employments in the sector that they work in, to try to promote best practice in the workplace. and be represented by a trade union to have a collective bargaining case progress through the Labour Court.
But how would they get a trade union in the first place if there's a hostile atmosphere towards trade unions?
Well, it's up to trade unions to organise as well. I've given them the legislation to organise. What no politician can do is do the organisation job for trade. Trade unions are very good at organisation. I have very close links with the trade unions. They wanted me to introduce the law that would allow them to collectively bargain through the Labour Court on behalf of the workers they represent. They have that now. And we have seen actually in a lot of sectors across the country, in security, in contract cleaning, and other vulnerable sectors, increases in trade union membership over the last period of time. The collective bargaining legislation I introduced has the potential to, if used properly by trade unions and employers, to address a lot of industrial relations issues in this country. So I'm quite personally proud of that. And this is a big institutional change that isn't automatically apparent maybe to a worker, but it is when they need the system to work.
Right.
You know.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. As we already mentioned, the USC is still there. Granted, it was reduced, but it's still there. Water charges as well, which seem to be particularly unpopular in Louth. Where apparently we have one of the lowest number of people who have registered, which would imply that we've got one of the lowest number of people in the country who've paid. Is it time at this stage, or is it something that needs to be done about Irish Water to scrap it or to scrap water charges, because it doesn't seem to be popular at all, particularly in County Louth?
Well, you don't simply scrap things because people don't find that they're popular. Governments have to take difficult decisions. I've always believed that we should have a publicly owned public water utility providing services up and down the country. I sat on local authorities for a number of years, Peter, and I noted every year, at the end of each year, our local authority and every other local authority going to the Department of the Environment, cap in hand, looking for whatever money was left over to resource our public water infrastructure. We have huge problems with water supply in this country. We have huge problems with some public water and sewage supplies in particular, going into the public water system. A lot of those issues have been addressed already by Irish Water. I believe in a public water utility owned by the Irish people, operated by the Irish government and accountable to the Irish people. And that's what we have now. It was never ideal to have dozens of different local authorities pretending that the water service ended at the county border. We need a national overview of that. We need national oversight of it. We have a public water utility now. It will remain a public water utility. And I think a country of the size of Ireland, and as well with the problems we've had around water supply, needs a public water utility that's accountable to the Irish people and accountable to the Dáil by way of being accountable to the Irish people. There's huge, for example, what happened in Roscommon over the last 20-30 years is absolutely disgraceful. Because of the concerted efforts that Irish Water have made and the focus that they've had in terms of their budget on Roscommon, a focus that Roscommon County Council couldn't have and didn't have because it wasn't resourced properly to deal with the nature of the problems they had. Nobody in Roscommon is now on a boil water notice. And I think that's important to note. It's actually making a real difference to people's lives. But the key is it's a public water utility. Public water utility.
I think most people think not being on a boiled water notice would be the absolute minimum. And probably what you've outlined about waters and what needs to be done to water, a lot of people would agree with it. And in some respects and it does need to be paid for. But the argument is that we've already paid for it. And Irish Water seems to be going from one calamity to another. It's been propped up with money from motor taxation is what we're hearing. This is what I would imagine people are against, is not that against Irish Water, not that it has to be paid, but that it has already been paid for.
Well, people also want to see the USC reduced, and people also want to see the rates of income tax reduced, and people want to see VAT reduced. One of the problems that we've had in this country is that we had a very, very, very narrow tax and charging base. Most socialists across the world would believe that you pay for public water utilities, that you pay for assets in terms of the property, that that a property tax is justified. I believe that it is. And they believe in making sure that there is a broad tax base. We didn't have a broad tax base in this country. We had a tax base and a public services system that was overly dependent on property transactions and one particular industry, the construction industry. Now we've got a much more mixed and much more diverse economy. So what's enabling us to reduce the USC, and what we want to do in the Labour Party over a 5-year period, is abolish the USC for people who are earning under €72,000. And that's where we actually differ from Fine Gael, for example, and indeed from Fianna Fáil. we want to make sure that the resources that we have to reduce taxes over the next few years is focused on people who are on low and middle incomes. And what we want to do as well is to make sure that we don't abolish it for people who are better off, because the better off, by virtue of the fact that they have more money, that they are better off, should, and are paying, a stronger contribution. And what we also want to do, and this is really, really important, and this is going to be the debate that we have to have, particularly over the next few weeks. We have fiscal space amounting to 10 to 12 billion euros available over the next 5 years, based on our anticipated growth figures, anticipated jobs figures, and what we require to invest in public services. It's our view and it's our vision, for every €1 that you introduce in tax cuts, that we want to introduce €3 on top of that on investment in public services, in our hospitals, in our schools, our police service, in our public infrastructure. We're spending €42 billion on a capital infrastructure plan for the country over the next 5 years. We're going to reopen that again next year based on our future economic growth projections, to make sure that we can invest even more in that, because we need to make sure that our high-speed broadband network reaches every town and village in the country, regardless of where you live. We need to make sure that our motorway system is extended, for example, to the west of Ireland, because that's not well served by a good, strong motorway system, if we're to achieve my ambition for full employment by 2018.
Well, it might very well be his ambition to have full employment by 2018, but it's not the government's. Unemployment currently stands at just below 10%, and even in their projections, which go up to 2021, there is no prediction for full employment. Full employment would mean less than 5% unemployment, and by 2018 it is seen that unemployment will still be above 7%, so it might be his ambition, his goal, but it's not that of the government's.
And making sure as well that every single region in the country benefits from the jobs growth we're experiencing, because for the first year or two of the recovery that we're now experiencing, the bulk of the jobs were created in our major cities and our major towns. But we've seen now over the last 18 months or so that in fact the live register rates are coming down very rapidly in the border region and in the south, in the southeast and in the Midlands as well. Three areas that are quite different and diverse. There's a lot of difference between Donegal and Louth, for example. In Louth we have an extra 2,000 IDA jobs on top of what we had in 2011. We have 5,000 Enterprise Ireland jobs, which is huge. Enterprise Ireland is actually a very, very important agency working with Indigenous Irish companies to promote exports. And we've had considerable success in that whole area. We've had 1,200 people come off the live register into jobs in Louth in the last year. That's very positive. We've more to do, a lot more to do.
Indeed, the "a lot done, more to do" slogan was from Fianna Fáil's 2002 election campaign, one which, while not directly, its message certainly has been repeated a lot in the last few weeks from Fine Gael and Labour.
Now, a lot of that sounds a little bit like the rhetoric we heard in the 2002-2007 general election. A lot done, more to do. Are we getting the same thing from Fine Gael and Labour?
But we have done a lot. I wouldn't like to paraphrase Bertie Ahern, but we have done a lot. Our first job was to stabilise the country and make sure that we could keep public services going, make sure that we could protect social welfare rates, which is something that we did do, the core social rates of social protection, but also to get people back to work. We've huge opportunities in this country over the next 5 years. We grew by 7% this year. We'll probably grow by about 6% next year in terms of economy, and about 4.5% for the subsequent years up to 2020. We've options there in terms of what we do. Do we decide that we're going to cut tax for everybody, or do we decide that we're going to invest in public services? And I favour public services over tax cuts by a ratio of 3 to 1, because we need good, strong public services.
Would that not provide a difference between yourselves and your current and possibly future government partners in Fine Gael? So how would you reconcile that difference?
We reconcile those differences by going to the electorate with a manifesto and asking them to support it, and we then sit down, if we have a mandate from the Irish people, to negotiate a programme for government to try to get our agenda advanced over the next 5 years. The reality is that we're the only party on the left that wants to go into government. We're the only party that's got a track record in government of delivery for working people. We've a lot more to do in terms of job creation and introducing more employment protections that I want to introduce, for example, around abolishing exploitative if and when contracts, which most people would describe as 0 hour contracts. We don't have 0 hour contracts in Ireland, but we have now a new phenomenon that we've studied called if and when contracts. Very troubling, a very troubling phenomenon, as is the phenomenon that we've seen recently evolve of bogus self-employment, which is a particular problem in the construction industry, and is an issue as well in the media and in financial services and the information technology sector. So we have plans essentially to reform and redefine employment, and to make sure as well that people who are essentially, for all intents and purposes, employed, but they may only have one contract with the same employer, they're effectively employed. They lose out on employment rights and employment protections and on social welfare payments, for example, and social welfare opportunities if they happen to fall outside of the workforce. So, and the Exchequer loses out as well because they're not paying the appropriate tax, and neither is the person who is, for all intents and purposes, employing them. Yeah. So we've a lot of work to do in that whole area, and that's what we want to do in terms of the future. We've a lot to do as well in this area. I mean, my priority in the Drogheda area in particular is to ensure we can continue the jobs growth. We have designated Drogheda as a future centre for digital payments in Ireland. That's now policy for government and the IDA and Enterprise Ireland. There's potential for hundreds of jobs in this area through the IDA and Enterprise Ireland in that sort of space.
It's quite interesting, really, because in recent reports it's been announced that Drogheda will lose out on foreign direct investment, and its neighbouring town of Dundalk is the one who will benefit from it.
We've also as well, and I've secured a boundary review for Drogheda, which if we successfully secure in terms of what the next Minister for the Environment will do on foot of the recommendation he will receive from the independent body that was set up to review the boundary with Meath, will actually show the true reflection and true extent of the town of Drogheda. We've also got a review coming up of the National Spatial Strategy. The National Spatial Strategy, which was developed by Fianna Fáil in 2002, Peter, effectively ignores Drogheda. Drogheda's neither a gateway nor a hub. That means we lose out on some funding and investment opportunities. So we've reviewed that 5 years early. It's a 20-year planning framework we're going to introduce, which is an important thing to do, I think, because we need to be able to plan our economy and plan our services and plan investment in a kind of an evidence-based way to make sure that every area gets what every area is entitled to, and that it makes sense and that it all adds up.
And another big area locally is the Lourdes Hospital, third worst record in the country for having people on trolleys. This is not a new issue. What is going to be done about that?
Well, it's what is being done about it and what's going to be done about it. We have secured in the capital programme for the HSE for the next 3 to 4 years resources to extend the Lourdes Hospital. We're going to extend the Lourdes Hospital quite significantly. We've also secured resources to double the size of the emergency department. One of the problems in the Lourdes Emergency Department was that when the reconfiguration programme was introduced in the early 2000s, we didn't get an adequate number of acute medical beds to deal with the demand in terms of the closure of services in the Louth County Hospital, the diminution of services in Monaghan and as well in Navan. So there's huge pressure. There are extra nurses working in Lourdes Hospital now. There are extra doctors over the last 12 months. It's actually very difficult. It's proved to be difficult to attract nurses to work in the Irish health system at the moment and get people to come back. Now we're trying to do that, and the Minister for Health is trying to make sure that we can do that. The uptake doesn't seem to be
very high on that, does it, so far?
It's not as high as we would like.
The uptake in the recruitment drive to the HSE is indeed quite poor. They have a target of 500 new jobs, and so far only 75 have been taken up. And indeed, the nurses organisation have said it's 5,000 that is actually needed, so the uptake is quite low there.
One of the reasons, for example, why we're cutting the USC for working people is to make it more attractive for people to take up work and for immigrants to return to take the jobs that are available here and the jobs that will be available over the next couple of years. So it's about employing more doctors and more nurses. We're getting better at retaining the nurses who are qualifying in Ireland now the last couple of years. It's actually those nurses who have some experience, who maybe left Ireland. Some are coming back. You could argue as well maybe that we're not training enough, and the Minister of Health would argue that we're not paying hospital consultants enough to allow them to work in Ireland. A number of years ago you might have about 20 applications for doctors for a consultant's post in a hospital in Ireland. Now you're maybe getting 1 or 2 per post, as I understand it.
And I'm sure there won't be too many people shedding a tear for the low rate of pay for hospital consultants.
So what we need to do is to make it attractive, of course, for people to work in our health service. What we're also doing as well is expanding our public nursing home system and expanding home care packages for older people. We've kept the cottage hospital open. The cottage hospital was under threat in 2011. That's open now as a transitional care unit, which means that by and large, older people who are not any longer acutely medically ill and are in the Lord's Hospital can move to the cottage hospital for a period of weeks to get them better and into a position where they can come home or get into longer term nursing home care if that's their choice. You know?
So after the election coming up, and we assume it's going to be on the 26th of February, although
Let's see
what happens. Is Fine Gael the only coalition partner that you would have after the election?
Well, we want to we want to see this government re-elected. We've worked well together. We're two parties with different views on things. They're a centre-right party, we're a centre-left party. That's the two great traditions in European politics: social democracy and Christian democracy. And in 2011, it needed a national government to resolve the problems that we had. What we want to do now going forward is continue to work together to create the jobs that we need and invest in the public services that people want to see us investing in. And we can only do that if we've got a strong economy. There are plenty of things that I disagree with Fine Gael on, and there are plenty of things that they disagree with me on. But it's worked well. We have two separate agendas. That's very clear going into the election. We have differences on USC. We don't believe it should be abolished for everybody. They do. Right. I don't believe it should be abolished for everybody because €4 billion disappears overnight. Right. And we need that for our hospitals and our schools. Okay. So we have differences. We're going forward to try to elect this government because we think it would work. Okay.
And then just finally, in a nutshell statement, why should people vote for you?
Because my life's work in public life has been about job creation and the economy. I believe in the dignity of work, and too many people in this country over the last few years haven't had work and haven't had that dignity that comes from work. So it's not about jobs at any cost. It's about jobs that pay well, that are decent, sustainable, and where people are protected in the workplace. And my track record, particularly over the last year and a half, in bringing in radical employment rights legislation and encouraging our economy to grow and create jobs, I think and I hope merits some attention from the electorate.